Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army.
Thanks for joining us. We've got a really incredible deep dive planned for you today.
We absolutely do. Today, we are stepping into a profoundly fascinating time capsule.
Oh, totally.
We have our hands on this document titled A Compilation of Lectures Given at the 6th Annual Rescue Mission Training Institute. And the year is 1956.
It's 1956, right?
Yeah, it was edited by a man named J.B. Moellendick. So our mission for you today is to step inside this mid-century training institute and, really unpack exactly how these religious leaders approached the monumental, complex task of urban rescue work.
It was a massive undertaking.
Right. We're looking at an era where people were trying to balance this intense spiritual fervor with the highly practical, civic, and frankly exhausting realities of running a social institution.
Yeah, and what's so fascinating here is the cultural whiplash you experience when you open these pages. Well, I mean, if you ask anyone to picture 1956 America, you almost immediately conjure up this collective memory of post-war prosperity, right?
Right, sure. The Eisenhower era.
Exactly. The suburbs are exploding in size. The economy is just absolutely humming.
White picket fences.
Yeah, and the television set is becoming the glowing centerpiece of the American living room. There's this glossy, manicured, mid-century modern sheen layered over everything.
The classic American dream narrative.
Right. The narrative of the 1950s is one of triumph and domestic bliss. But these lectures drag you out of the suburbs and drop you right into the alleys of the inner city.
They really pull you underneath that shiny surface.
They absolutely do. It's a totally different world.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because beneath that polished surface, the urban centers of the 1950s were dealing with shifting demographics, severe poverty, and the massive, often hidden hangover of addiction.
Specifically, alcoholism, yeah.
Right, and the people giving these lectures were in the trenches of a society that mostly wanted to just, look the other way.
You didn't want to see it.
They really didn't. They were dealing with the messy, broken humans who didn't fit into the neat little boxes of the new American dream.
Yeah.
And before we can even begin to look at how a mission operates, the programs, the beds, the soup kitchens, we have to look at the people running them.
The personnel.
Exactly. Because a mission is only ever going to be as effective as the sheer passion of its workers.
Right.
And to understand the temperature of that passion, we have to look at a lecture given by Reverend William Seath. He tackles the topic of workable personal evangelism.
And he doesn't pull any punches either.
He really doesn't. He resurrects this striking phrase from a historic rescue mission figure, Jerry McCauley.
Oh, the soul on fire quote.
That's the one. He argued that the absolute crying need is for a worker whose, quote, soul is just on fire, longing to get at every wretch and bring him into the fold.
That phrasing is incredibly intentional. Soul on fire.
It's intense.
It is. And Reverend Seath is drawing a battle line here because he is vehemently opposing a trend he sees creeping into charitable work in 1956.
Which is?
Professionalization.
Oh.
Remember, the 1950s is the era of the organization man. It's the rise of modern corporate management, efficiency experts, and, streamlined processes.
So everyone wants to run a charity like a Ford assembly line.
Exactly. And Seath looks at that corporate mindset seeping into the rescue mission, and he is terrified.
Really terrified.
Yeah, he asks his audience point blank whether they have allowed themselves to become, quote, professional, to the point where methods and techniques are suddenly more important than the simple, raw message of salvation.
Wow.
He's warning that if you treat human recovery like an administrative assembly line, the mission becomes just this sterile machine.
I see the danger he's pointing out, but isn't it a bit naive to think you can run a massive urban facility purely on raw emotion?
Well, he goes pretty far with it.
He does. He goes so far as to say that evangelism isn't just one department's job. He tells this cautionary tale about a large mission where one specific man was put in charge of the entire spiritual program.
Oh, right, and everyone else just ignored it.
Exactly. Everyone else on staff just treated the spiritual health of the people coming in as, his department.
And Seath calls that a total travesty.
He does. He insists that every single person on the payroll, from the welfare secretary interviewing intakes, all the way to the cook in the kitchen, and the board members balancing the checkbook, they must all be personal evangelists.
Right. He argues that if you are hiring a welfare secretary, the ultimate criteria can't just be their typing speed or, their organizational skills.
The first question must be, can this person lead someone to Christ.
Yeah. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, Seith is establishing a monolithic organizational culture.
For sure.
He's citing Dr. Ferris D. Whitesell to argue that this fire has to be a passion, a proclamation, a program, and a practice.
It has to permeate everything.
Exactly. It has to be experimental, lived out in the daily grind, not just theoretical theology debated in a classroom.
But wait, what keeps this from devolving into sheer fanaticism?
Right. Well, that's where Seith grounds this fire in surprisingly strict practical constraints.
Yeah.
He doesn't want wild-eyed zealots running around the dining hall.
Thank goodness.
Right. He demands that workers maintain what he calls a dignity in Christ, which translates to a meticulously neat, tidy physical appearance.
Okay, that part threw me for a loop.
It's so specific to the era, isn't it?
It really is. He writes, can you imagine Jesus Christ being careless about his looks or appearing in public in a dirty or unkempt robe? I cannot.
It's such a funny mental image.
I know. In 1956, part of proving you had a soul on fire meant you made sure your shirt was ironed and your shoes were shined.
There is absolutely no room for the sloppy, chaotic mystic in his view of mission work.
None at all. I found myself wondering, how do you reconcile those two things? A wild, untamed, burning passion for souls, packaged neatly in a gray flannel suit.
Well, you reconcile it by understanding the intense public scrutiny these organizations were under at the time.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, Seith notes that the public is highly sensitive and watches the professing Christian like a hawk. They're quick to discover and point out flaws.
So they had to look the part.
Exactly. The fire he's talking about isn't an excuse for behavioral or administrative chaos. Rather, it is the fuel required to sustain a highly disciplined, grueling life of service.
The neat appearance is just a signaling mechanism.
Right, to a skeptical 1950s society that the mission is trustworthy.
But trying to keep that fire burning brightly while managing the soul-crushing realities of daily administration, that brings us to the ultimate bottleneck of any organization.
The superintendent.
Yes, the superintendent. And that role sounds like an absolute nightmare.
Oh, completely.
Herbert E. Eberhard gives a lecture specifically on the responsibilities of this role. And Eberhard, he doesn't coat this in lofty spiritual language at all.
He really strips away the romance.
He states outright that the superintendent is the greatest asset in any rescue mission, but simultaneously, and for the exact same reasons, the greatest problem.
Eberhard brings a deeply wry, almost exhausted realism to the Institute.
Exhausted is the perfect word.
Yeah. He shares this highly specific, painfully relatable anecdote to illustrate the sheer unpredictability of his job.
The truck driver story.
Yes. He tells the audience that on the very morning he sat down to dictate his lecture for this training institute, trying to collect his thoughts on spiritual leadership, he got a phone call.
And the call wasn't about a spiritual breakthrough.
Nope. His mission's truck driver had been thrown in the city jail.
Oh, man, that's rough.
So Eberhard had to drop his theologies, scramble to find $50, and go bail his employee out.
That is the quintessential reality of leadership. You're trying to write a visionary manifesto, and instead you're bailing your logistics guy out of the slammer.
It really grounds everything they're talking about in the dirt of the real world.
It does. And Eberhard shares this incredible definition of an executive that he found from a Washington printer.
Oh, this part is hilarious.
For anyone listening to this who has ever managed a team, this is going to sound painfully familiar. He says an executive has practically nothing to do except decide what is to be done, tell somebody to do it.
And then listen to reasons why it shouldn't be done, or why it should be done by someone else or done in a different way entirely.
Yes. And then it goes on. The executive then has to follow up to see if the thing has been done.
Only to discover it has not been done.
Right. Inquire as to why, listen to a barrage of excuses from the person who should have done it, follow up again, only to discover that it has finally been done.
But done completely incorrectly.
Exactly. Then you have to point out how it should have been done in the first place. Conclude that as long as it has been done, it might as well be left where it is.
And then privately wonder if it isn't time to get rid of a person who cannot do a single thing right.
Only to reflect that this employee probably has a spouse and a large family, and that, frankly, whoever you hire to replace them would probably be just as bad, if not worse.
It is a masterclass in capturing pure administrative fatigue.
It really is.
Eberhard is laying bare the fact that a rescue mission superintendent requires a broader set of qualifications than almost any other branch of charitable work.
Yeah, I mean, before lunch, you were expected to be an ordained minister, a compelling evangelist, a trained social worker, a financial wizard.
And a crisis manager dealing with the local police.
But Eberhard isn't just complaining about the workload, right? He points out a massive existential danger baked into this specific model of leadership.
He does. He calls it the Scylla and Charybdis of mission work.
Right. And for those who might not be fresh on their Greek mythology, Scylla and Charybdis were two immortal sea monsters positioned on opposite sides of a narrow strait.
A very tight squeeze.
Very. Scylla was a six-headed monster who would eat your sailors, and Charybdis was a massive whirlpool that would suck your entire ship down.
So being caught between a rock and a hard place.
Exactly. Navigating a path where avoiding one fatal danger brings you dangerously close to another. So in the context of the rescue mission, what are these two monsters Eberhard is terrified of?
The primary monster he is terrified of is the cult of personality.
Ah, the founder syndrome.
Yes. The danger is building the entire work around a single charismatic individual. Eberhard warns that if a superintendent possesses a massive personality, if they are incredibly popular, a fluent and persuasive speaker, a dynamic fundraiser, the overwhelming temptation is for them to build the mission around themselves.
Rather than around the community or around Christ.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
He points to historical examples of missions that suffered for decades or completely collapsed into the doldrums simply because the popular founder passed away or moved on.
So the entire institution's credibility and momentum were tied to just one human being.
Right. As the old saying goes, like priest, like people.
I want to throw an analogy at you because this sounds exactly like the modern-day Silicon Valley startup founder.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
You have this founder with an intense reality distortion field of charisma. Their personal force of will, their borderline obsession is absolutely necessary to get the project off the ground.
They need that ego to get the initial funding.
Exactly. They needed to convince talented people to work 80-hour weeks for little pay and to bend the market to their vision.
Right.
But if that founder doesn't eventually learn to step back, build an independent management team, and institutionalize the work into actual processes,
their massive ego shifts from being the company's biggest asset to its most fatal liability.
yes, the company literally cannot survive them.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, how on earth were these 1956 mission leaders supposed to navigate this?
It's a huge challenge.
I mean, is it even possible to have that unyielding fire Reverend Seath demands without accidentally burning down the entire organization through ego?
That is the razor-thin strait they are trying to sail through. Seath demands a soul on fire. Eberhard warns that fire left unchecked becomes catastrophic narcissism.
So what's the solution?
The solution they point to, which is deeply rooted in their theology, is a radical, almost severe submission to a higher authority.
Okay, humility.
Right. The humility required to wake up every day and say, I am entirely replaceable, but the work is not.
Wow, that's powerful.
Eberhard insists that a leader must be genuinely called to the work, not just choosing it as a convenient career path or, a stage to perform on.
Because believing you are called acts as a psychological defense mechanism against the ego.
Exactly. You aren't doing the work for your own glory. You view yourself merely as an instrument.
But keeping your own ego in check and managing your staff is really a luxury problem if the city you operate in is actively trying to shut you down or render you obsolete.
Oh, absolutely. The external pressures were immense.
We have to look at those pressures because the existential threat to the rescue mission in 1956 was very real.
Reverend Francis V. Crumley addresses this skepticism head-on in his lecture.
Right. He highlights the specific, biting pushback they were getting from a society that thought it had outgrown the need for old-fashioned religion.
This is where the historical context of the post-war boom becomes crucial. Crumley talks about an interaction he had with a religious editor of a large daily newspaper in Philadelphia.
And what did the editor say?
He essentially looked at Crumley and asked, why do we even need rescue missions anymore?
Wow. Bold question.
Yeah. The editor pointed out that Alcoholics Anonymous, which was gaining massive cultural traction in the 1950s, seemed to be doing the exact work that rescue missions formerly did.
So AA was stepping on their turf, in his eyes.
Right. The editor recalled a flourishing mission in his town that had recently closed its doors, and his only takeaway from its closure was that drunks were made sober, and since AA was now making drunks sober, the mission was a redundant institution.
You could just feel Crumley's utter appallment leaping off the page.
He was furious.
To think that a religious editor, someone supposed to understand spiritual matters, reduced the mission's entire holistic, spiritual, and social enterprise down to just the mechanical act of making drunks sober.
It highlights a massive disconnect in how they viewed human recovery.
It does. And Crumley also shares this incredible story about a wealthy, philanthropic woman who remembered the mission in her will.
Oh, the inheritance story.
Yeah. But before she finalized it, she came to his office for a meeting. And she told him, straight to his face, that she wasn't interested in a single religious thing they were attempting to do.
She only cared about the physical food the men receive.
Exactly. She actually asked him, if we gave you more money, would the men receive more food? And frankly, why don't you just give them 3 full meals a day anyway and stop bothering them with sermons?
Just incredible. That interaction perfectly encapsulates the rapid secularization of social care that was accelerating throughout the mid-20th century.
Everyone wanted the charity without the church.
Right. The general public, the newly expanding state welfare departments, and professional social workers were increasingly looking at these gritty rescue missions and saying, you are a relic.
You are outmoded and impractical.
Exactly. They thought, we have state-funded welfare programs now to handle poverty. We have psychiatric interventions and modern medicine to handle mental distress. We have the 12 steps of AA to handle addiction.
So they thought the aggressive religious methodology was simply no longer required.
Yeah, they thought they'd outgrown it.
I can imagine how demoralizing that must have been for the mission workers.
It had to be.
But what's really fascinating is that the mission leaders didn't panic because they had faced this exact flavor of societal arrogance before.
Oh, the Prohibition parallel.
Yes. Reverend Clifford Hartzell steps in with this amazing historical context. He reminds his audience to look back at the 18th Amendment.
Prohibition.
Right.
Yeah.
He says that when alcohol was constitutionally outlawed in the United States, high society and the government universally assumed that rescue missions would just naturally disappear.
Because the logic was, well, alcohol is illegal now, nobody can get a drink, so the problem of the urban drunkard is solved.
The missions will be passé. But instead of closing, what did the missions do?
They pivoted.
They did.
Because they understood something the government didn't. Society thought they had cured the underlying disease by legislating away the primary substance.
But the missions knew the substance was just a symptom of a much deeper human fracture.
Exactly. So when the Great Depression hit shortly after Prohibition, shattering the economy, the missions were the institutions already on the ground positioned to step up.
They addressed the massive, catastrophic housing and relief needs.
They established pay beds for millions of transient, out-of-work men. They transformed from being just sobriety checkpoints into crucial, life-saving relief hubs.
And Hartzell takes that historical lesson and extrapolates it directly to their present day in 1956.
He does. He warns the audience that the symptoms of societal decay are always shifting, but the root rot remains.
It wasn't just transient men living in warehouses by the docks like it was in the 1830s. Now, Hartzell points out they're dealing with the modern scourge of the hit-and-run drunk driver.
Middle-class people destroying lives and using the excuse, I was drinking.
Yes. And then he cites a statistic that must have shocked the room. He claims there was a recognized population of 500,000 women drunkards in the nation at that time.
We really need to pause and unpack that statistic because it is a devastating indictment of the 1950s narrative.
500,000.
Yeah. Why were there 500,000 women struggling with severe alcoholism in an era that supposedly glorified the domestic housewife?
You have to look at the intense isolation of the new suburban layout.
Exactly. You have women who had perhaps worked in factories during World War II, experiencing independence and solidarity, who were now thrust back into highly isolated domestic roles.
The trauma of the war, the rigid social expectations, the keeping up with the Joneses mentality. It created a pressure cooker.
And because of the severe stigma, this drinking was largely hidden.
Right.
It was happening behind closed doors, masked by Tupperware parties and PTA meetings.
Wow. That context changes everything. It means the mission was constantly having to expand its vision to encompass family work, women's shelters, and domestic interventions just to stay relevant to the actual bleeding needs on the ground.
It exposes the utter social blindness of prosperity.
Yes, the 1950s middle class, polishing their new appliances and mowing their suburban lawns, desperately wanted to believe that poverty and addiction were problems of the past.
Primitive issues that had been solved by modern science, good government policy, and a booming stock market.
But Hartzell is standing up and saying, no, the demons haven't left. They are just wearing new, more expensive clothes.
Exactly. The assumption of the era was like assuming we don't need hospitals anymore simply because someone invented daily multivitamins.
That's a great way to put it. Society thought they had inoculated themselves against suffering.
But they hadn't.
Okay, but I have to push back here on behalf of the skeptical newspaper editor.
Sure, go for it.
If AA is effectively handling the addiction and the state welfare office is handling the food and housing, does the rescue mission run the risk of constantly, artificially changing its mandate just to justify its own continued existence?
That's the logical question.
Right. Like, at what point does a nonprofit organization look in the landscape, see that the government has stepped up and say, okay, we achieved what we set out to do. Our job here is done. Let's close the doors.
It's a highly logical question from a secular standpoint, but it fundamentally misunderstands how these leaders viewed human nature.
How so?
The mission leaders in these texts would categorically reject the premise that their ultimate job was ever just to feed a hungry person or sober up a drunk person.
So the goal was never just relief.
Exactly. They would argue that the state welfare office and AA are merely treating the surface-level symptoms, but the mission is the only institution equipped to treat the terminal root cause.
Which exposes a massive, unbridgeable philosophical rift.
A huge one.
Right.
Between how a secular government and a religious mission view the concept of a healed human being.
And that brings us to the core philosophy of care. Reverend Leonard C. Hunt breaks down this philosophical clash brilliantly.
Yes, he titles his analysis The Social Casework Philosophy.
And he spells out exactly how the modern secular social worker views the world versus how the rescue mission views the world.
Right. According to Hunt, the secular social worker approaches a broken person believing that the cause of all their social dislocation, addiction, or poverty is a failure to have a well-integrated personality.
A well-integrated personality?
Yeah. In Hunt's framing, the social worker's ultimate goal is to develop a self-sufficient individual.
So relying on yourself.
Exactly. In modern psychology, the self is the undisputed center of authority.
Okay.
The goal of secular therapy and social work is to fortify that self, to remove its neuroses so it can make clear-cut, rational decisions and carry them into productive action within society.
It is a completely humanistic, psychologically driven framework where the human being is the master of their own destiny.
Perfectly said.
But the rescue mission's worldview is not just different, it is radically diametrically opposed to that.
Oh, completely. The mission's goal is total spiritual conversion.
Right. The ideal outcome is absolutely not self-sufficiency. In fact, if you asked Reverend Hunt, he would argue that relying on the self and trying to be self-sufficient is exactly the arrogant delusion that got the addict into the gutter in the first place.
Exactly. They saw self-reliance as the core problem.
Right. The mission's goal isn't a well-integrated personality. It's a Christ-balanced personality, where a higher power, not the self, is the absolute center of authority, dictating all activities and thoughts.
It is a profound philosophical divergence, and it dictates how they view every single physical service they offer.
Because it's not just about the soup and the bed anymore.
No, Reverend Crumley outlines the vast array of physical programs these missions ran, the massive housing dorms, the daily feeding programs, the clothing distribution.
Right, all the operational stuff.
But he emphasizes a crucial, non-negotiable point. Mission workers must never forget that relieving the present physical condition is not the goal of the rescue mission.
So handing a man a sandwich is purely a tactical means to an end.
Exactly. And that end is the complete spiritual conversion of the individual.
Which totally explains why Crumley was so dismissive of that wealthy woman's request to just give the men 3 square meals and drop the religious sermon.
Right, they were speaking 2 different languages.
From her perspective, a full stomach was a success. But from the mission's perspective, if you just feed a man, clothe him, and sober him up without addressing his eternal soul, you haven't saved him at all.
You have merely produced a healthier, more comfortable sinner.
Wow, that's a stark way to look at it.
It is. And this intense spiritual focus creates a fascinating internal danger regarding what they called their industrial divisions.
The industrial divisions, these were the work programs, the thrift stores, and the small businesses the missions ran to generate revenue and provide jobs for the men, right?
Exactly. And the texts issue a severe warning here. They say a mission that becomes 100% self-supporting financially through its own industries is in great immediate danger.
I found that warning utterly counterintuitive.
I mean, it goes against everything we're taught about nonprofits.
Seriously, if you talk to any nonprofit director today, becoming 100% financially self-sustaining is the holy grail.
It's the dream.
It means you don't have to beg for grants or rely on fickle donors. Why on earth would 1956 mission leaders view financial independence as a threat?
Because, in their view, financial independence breeds spiritual independence, which they viewed as fatal.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, if a mission no longer needs the financial support of the local churches or the prayers of the community because their thrift stores are generating massive profits, they risk losing their spiritual fervor.
They just drift into becoming a business.
Exactly. They slowly drift into becoming just another corporate business that happens to employ marginalized people.
So the struggle is actually part of the process.
The constant, humbling struggle for daily funds forces the leadership to remain entirely dependent on faith. If the industrial division takes over the balance sheet, the physical provision overtakes the spiritual mission. They lose their why.
So if the ultimate why is spiritual conversion, the central, indispensable tool for that conversion is the Bible.
And Mrs. Peter Quartel gives a lecture that serves as a masterclass on how these institutions viewed Scripture.
Yes, and she doesn't use theological jargon either.
Not at all. She uses deeply visceral, working-class metaphors.
She says the Bible operates as a lighthouse, cutting through the fog to show the safe way to shore.
And a storehouse.
Right, she literally compares it to a neighborhood grocery store, saying that just as you go to the grocer for physical calories, you go to the Bible for the spiritual calories needed by the weak and hopeless.
She also calls it a powerhouse, generating actual, measurable power to animate a powerless addict.
And finally, a firehouse, equipped with the heavy machinery necessary to put out the raging fires of temptation.
Mrs. Quartel represents a very specific, uncompromising, and highly rigid theological stance that was prevalent in the movement.
Extremely rigid.
She advises new teachers that if they are invited as guests into a local church, they shouldn't get bogged down in needless theological debates or controversial doctrines.
But when it comes to the Bible itself, operating within the walls of the mission, she demands absolute, unwavering literalism. Her, quote, defending this literalism is simultaneously hilarious and staggering.
It really is.
She tells the audience, if my Bible told me a sardine swallowed Jonah, I would believe it, not because I could understand it, for the only sardines I know anything about come packed in mustard in small cans.
It's quite the image.
But I'm dealing with a God whose thoughts are not my thoughts, and if he says it, I believe it. I have to admit, reading that in the 21st century, it sounds incredibly anti-intellectual.
It does.
It sounds like a willful refusal to engage with history, metaphor, or science.
It does sound jarring to modern ears, but we really have to look at the utility of that literalism in its specific context.
What do you mean?
Imagine the environment of a 1950s rescue mission. You are dealing with men and women whose internal lives are in absolute, terrifying chaos.
Their minds have been shattered by trauma and addiction.
Exactly. In that triage environment, indulging in complex, nuanced theological debates about whether a biblical story is a historical event or a poetic allegory.
It's a luxury they simply cannot afford.
Right. They need an anchor point that does not move. They need to present an absolute, unshakable, black and white authority to replace the deeply compromised, untrustworthy authority of the addict's own mind.
Ah, okay. That makes sense.
The sardine quote is humorous, but fundamentally it is about establishing an unquestionable bedrock foundation for psychological and spiritual recovery.
Okay, let me see if I can distill this massive philosophical gap into an analogy.
Let's hear it.
Imagine a car breaks down on the side of the highway. The secular social worker pulls up, looks at the car, and says, you have a flat tire. Let me patch that tire, put some air in it, and soon you'll be able to drive yourself wherever you want to go.
They are trying to restore the car to self-sufficiency.
Exactly. But the rescue mission worker pulls up, looks at the exact same car, and says, it doesn't matter if you patch the tire because the entire engine block is fundamentally cracked. The engine cannot fix itself.
It needs to be hoisted out and replaced entirely by the manufacturer.
Yes. They fundamentally disagree on the nature of the fix. So if you are a mission leader, believing the engine is totally broken, how difficult must it have been to collaborate with city agencies, mayors, and health departments?
Extremely difficult.
When your underlying definition of what constitutes a healed human being is so radically out of step with the modern state.
It was incredibly difficult, and it required a massive amount of diplomatic skill, swallow your pride humility, and strategic maneuvering.
Which perfectly bridges us to the final major theme of these lectures, surviving the city.
Right, because despite this massive philosophical gap, the rescue mission couldn't exist in a spiritual vacuum.
They still had to buy property, pass inspections, and survive in a heavily regulated, rapidly modernizing urban environment.
Reverend Hartzell addresses this friction with City Hall directly.
He paints a picture of the old days of mission work, where city ordinances, things like modern sanitation requirements, fire safety codes, and mandatory pest control, were viewed by old-school mission leaders as oppressive, secular interference.
They saw it as the government harassing them.
Right. And the tragic result was that a lot of early 20th century missions were notoriously filthy, squalid places that respectable church people completely shunned.
But by 1956, Hartzell is standing in the podium urging the new generation of mission leaders to completely change their tune.
He tells them they must embrace these strict, expensive city standards.
He acknowledges that, yes, retrofitting a 100-year-old building for modern fire codes might seem financially oppressive, but he argues that these laws have actually worked out for the mission's good.
Why? Just for public perception?
Because operating a clean, highly functional, up-to-code facility makes the mission a vastly better public testimony for Christ.
Oh, so it's tied back to evangelism again.
Exactly. He explicitly warns the audience that stubbornly refusing to cooperate with city health ordinances under the guise of religious freedom is a sure way to close your mission.
It's a very practical realization. You can't save a man's soul if the city health department has padlocked your front doors because of a severe bedbug infestation.
No, you definitely can't.
So they had to play ball with the city regulators. And that practical necessity leads to a really fascinating paradox regarding the physical geography of rescue work.
Right. Where do you put the building?
Where exactly should a multi-million-dollar rescue mission be located in a city?
Hartzell argues passionately that the mission must be located right in the heart of the Skid Row area or on the wrong side of the tracks.
Not out in the suburbs.
No, because proximity is everything. You have to be where the people who desperately need you actually are.
He points out that opening a gritty rescue mission in a nice, decent, middle-class section of town and then importing undesirable, struggling individuals into that neighborhood will spark massive civic backlash.
It lowers property values, harms local businesses, and alienates the public.
You have to build the lifeboat where the ship is sinking.
But, and here is the brilliant paradox, while the mission must be located in the darkest, most desperate neighborhood, the physical building itself should be the cleanest, most well-lit, most attractive building on that street.
It absolutely shouldn't look like Skid Row once you walk through the front doors.
Right. It needs to serve as a physical incentive for cleaner, more desirable living standards.
It is designed to be an architectural beacon of order, towering in a neighborhood defined by chaos.
And that physical beacon of order had to be matched by a highly deliberate, carefully crafted public relations strategy.
Reverend Lyman Davis gives a fascinating, incredibly savvy lecture on how to get the mission's work before the eyes of a skeptical public.
He calls the mission the showcase of the church.
It is the one tangible place where the broader church can point and say to the secular world, look, right here, this is what God can do with a ruined life.
But Davis gives some PR advice that I think would give a modern corporate communications director a heart attack.
So absolutely. He tells the mission leaders, when you are giving tours to donors or the public, show them through the mission completely. Dirty closets, too.
That concept of the dirty closets is profound.
It really is.
Think about the era. The 1950s was the golden age of Madison Avenue advertising.
The Mad Men era.
Yes, an entire culture obsessed with projecting a flawless, manicured, vacuum-sealed image of perfection to the world.
And yet, in the middle of that cultural obsession with perfection, Davis is advocating for total, unflinching, uncomfortable transparency.
He knows instinctively that Christian donors and the general public deeply mistrust glossy, overly polished promotional material.
The public has to get to know the grit of the work to actually trust you.
Right.
I'm so fascinated by that dirty closet strategy. In a world where every corporation, every politician, and frankly, every church wanted to project mid-century modern perfection, the rescue mission's primary PR strategy was radical vulnerability.
It's kind of beautiful.
Does this kind of unfiltered, gritty transparency actually build more durable public trust than a polished corporate facade? Mm-hmm. Because today, nonprofits spend millions on slick rebranding campaigns.
Absolutely. It builds more durable trust because it proves authenticity.
People can smell fake.
They really can. If you only show the public the miraculous success stories and the freshly mopped dining hall, people intuitively know you are hiding the reality of addiction.
Right. By opening the dirty closets, by showing the chaotic intake rooms, the struggling individuals, the wear and tear on the facility, you are communicating something real.
You're saying, We are in the trenches. This is agonizing, messy, 2 steps forward, 1 step back work, and we aren't going to insult your intelligence by pretending otherwise.
It builds a bedrock of trust that slick marketing copy simply cannot buy.
Davis also drops this hard truth. He notes that you're not in business until you've been in business 5 years.
5 years just to be trusted.
He is managing expectations, warning them that this kind of deep community trust takes a half-decade of consistent, transparent action to solidify.
There are no overnight PR miracles.
None at all.
And speaking of 1950s PR, Davis specifically and emphatically advises against using the hottest new technology of the decade.
Television.
Right. He writes in his notes, TV. No. I was dying to know why he was so against it.
He gives a few really good reasons, actually. The airtime cost is far too high for a charity.
Okay, that's practical.
And the spiritual message is better heard deeply than seen fleetingly.
And I love the brutal honesty of this. He notes that mission workers are usually not experienced actors.
They knew their lane.
They really did. They knew that putting a stiff, awkward, exhausted superintendent under bright studio lights on a TV screen would come across as incredibly phony and do more harm than good.
They relied on word of mouth, what they called the grapevine, and letting the actual changed lives of the men and women speak for themselves in the community.
It is a masterclass in knowing your medium, knowing your limitations, and deeply respecting your audience.
They weren't trying to compete with Billy Graham's massive televised crusades.
No. They were trying to be the reliable, impeccably clean, fiercely passionate lighthouse on the darkest, most forgotten street in the city.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive into 1956.
When you pull all these threads together, you begin to see the staggering high-wire balancing act these mission leaders had to perform every single day.
It's exhausting just to think about.
Right. On the inside, they had to stoke and maintain a soul on fire to preach a gospel they believed with every fiber of their being was the only true cure for the human condition.
But simultaneously on the outside, they had to navigate complex city zoning laws.
Appease skeptical health inspectors.
Fend off intellectual critics who thought modern psychology and AA had made them obsolete.
Avoid getting dragged into petty theological squabbles with local churches.
And manage impossibly tight budgets without losing their fundamental reliance on faith.
It is a phenomenal historical case study in organizational survival.
And what strikes me is how much of this 1956 framework still applies directly today.
Oh, for sure.
Whether you are running a nonprofit shelter, a billion-dollar tech startup, or a grassroots community group, you are constantly caught in that same tension.
You are balancing a deeply held, passionate mission with the cold, hard realities of daily operations, public relations, and shifting cultural relevance.
You still have to figure out how to scale your work without building a destructive cult of personality around the charismatic founder.
You still have to figure out how to work constructively with government agencies that might not share your foundational philosophy.
The clothes have changed, the technology has changed, but the human organizational struggle is exactly the same.
So here is a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to ponder as you go about your week, building on everything we've unpacked today.
Let's hear it.
I want you to imagine if these 1956 mission leaders, with their sharply ironed shirts, their absolute unflinching belief in a literal Bible, and their burning passion for souls, walk through the glass doors of a highly sanitized, hyper-professionalized, modern urban nonprofit today.
What would they think?
Right, what would they think of what we've built?
Yeah.
In many ways, we have completely perfected the methods and techniques that we're so terrified of.
We have the big data analytics, the trauma-informed psychological frameworks, the slick marketing campaigns,
The massive state grants, and the optimized workflows.
Yeah.
But in our desperate quest for perfect, frictionless, highly professionalized social work, have we accidentally extinguished the untamed fire they believed was the only thing that could truly save a human life?
Have we spent the last 70 years perfectly fixing the X-ray machine, only to realize we've completely forgotten how to heal the patient?
That is the haunting question that every new generation of caregivers, leaders, and citizens has to answer for themselves.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep diving deep.